Today, we're going to be reading through James chapter 1, verses 12 to 18, and we're going to talk a little bit about temptation. Our text begins with James saying something particularly meaningful to us through this time in verse 12. He says, "Blessed is the man who remains steadfast under trial." Do you feel like you're under trial today? "For when he has stood the test, he will receive the crown of life, which God has promised to those who love him." This is very similar to the profound statement that Jesus makes in Matthew chapter 24, verse 13. Jesus says, "But the one who endures to the end will be saved." It is important to understand what James and Jesus are talking about here. Have you ever seen a scene in a movie where somebody falls suddenly from a great height and they catch hold of a rope, and that rope's the only thing holding them up, and their friends or someone else is on the other end of the rope, and they pull him up, and all that they have to do, their job, is to hold on to that rope, right? If they try to grab onto something else, it's going to drag them down. If they loosen their grip, they could fall. All they need to do is hold on to that rope as tight as they can, no matter what, and rely on their friends to do the heavy lifting. I want to tell you that is a great example of what Jesus and James are saying in these texts. Listen, that when they say remaining steadfast, when Jesus says enduring to the end, what he means is the person who keeps believing in Jesus to the end, the person who never lets go of Jesus in the end. Jesus is our hope, our salvation. He is the only eternal thing in this world that we can grab a hold of. So James is going to spend the rest of our time talking about one of the ways that the adversary attempts to loosen our grip on Christ. Verse 13, he says, "Let no one say when he is tempted, 'I am being tempted by God,' for God cannot be tempted with evil, and he himself tempts no one." James says to be careful not to accuse God of being at fault when you are enduring temptation of any kind. This is something that we often do. Adam did it in the Garden of Eden, remember? God confronts Adam and Eve for eating from the one tree, the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, that they weren't supposed to eat from. And Adam replies, "The woman that you put here gave it to me, and I ate." This brings me to a point that I made last Sunday in the sermon. I said, trusting God is incompatible with assuming that he causes everything to happen. It is a popular belief among some Christians to say that nothing happens outside of God's will, or that he causes everything to happen. Of course things happen outside of God's will. How many times in the Bible do we see people do the opposite of what God tells them to do? Sarai assumes that God caused her to be barren, and so she took it upon herself to create an heir for Abraham. If you and I believe that God causes everything, then we will have to assume that he also causes us to be tempted. And James warns against this. And then he tells us the truth of it. Verse 14, "But each person is tempted when he is lured and enticed by his own desires. It may be hard to swallow, but your propensity for sin does not come from God, and it does not come from the devil. It comes from inside of you." The sooner you realize this, the sooner you could start trusting God instead of blaming him and having victory over your sin. Verse 15. The desire comes from us. The desire, when it has conceived birth to sin, and sin, when it is fully grown, brings forth death. It's important to note that when the New Testament talks about death, it more often than not, it means spiritual death. It means separation from God. Remember, we have said that faith in Jesus is us holding on to the rope that will save us. So sin brings death, not by us reaching a limit of sins that we're allowed to commit, right? And then God shuts the door on us. No. Sin brings death because it causes us to loosen our belief in Jesus. It causes us to loosen our grip on the rope. Sin is literally us letting go of the rope with one hand and grabbing onto something else, right? And then getting pulled in two different directions. It pulls us away from Christ. The more we sin, the less we trust in Jesus. James concludes with a corrective action we must take. Verse 16, "Do not be deceived, my beloved brothers. Every good gift and every perfect gift is from above, coming down from the Father of lights, with whom there is no variation or shadow due to change. Of his own will he brought us forth by the word of truth, that we should be a kind of first fruits of his creation, we must understand that anything that is good comes from God. The devil wants you to blame him so that you won't trust him. James says that the key here is to remember that all good things, including and especially the gospel, right? The word, Jesus is the word of truth. Jesus is the truth, right? Makes us a first fruits of his creatures, saves our souls, right? Namely the gospel. It all comes from God. He is our lifeline. Don't turn on him. So, during this trial, don't let go of your rope. Remain steadfast. We'll see you tomorrow.